evening, ladies and gentlemen, and boys and girls that are in the room. It is an honor, and I'd like to start by thanking Festus for giving me the opportunity to serve the keynote speaker tonight. I'm very appreciative and thankful, so thank you.
You want me lunch, girl?
Somewhere you gotta keep it healthy and fresh. Now, with that being said, let me begin. Ladies and gentlemen, I come before you today to speak as a student representative for advocacy, a researcher in education, and a future scholar practicing in the theoretical frameworks of critical race theory and Black feminism. The concerns within education that I bring before you today are not original. They are nothing new. They stem from a long line of concerns that have existed among our society and as they continue to evolve and transition. We think about the word diversity as its representation in education. Many of us reflect on differences, and many of those differences include race. We also reflect on the gaps that exist within those differences, whether we consciously or subconsciously know that we practice in this process. For example, in education, the question that we continuously raise is that why is the dropout rate in post-secondary and secondary institutions consistently so high among people of color? Now, make no mistake that I struggle with the term people of color in its meaning, but today I'm going to use it to refer to Blacks, Latino, Chicano, Hispanic, Native Americans, and other non-white, non-Caucasian populations. For me, I would rephrase that question. I would ask what institutional factors or trends continue to contribute to the educational oppression of people of color. Thank you. Now, I am in no way saying that there are circumstances that are not self-fulfilling, but what I am saying is that there is a presence of deficitness that exists about students who are victims of oppression, and that also there is a deficitness that exists in reference to the first appearance of students of color. When I speak today, I will reflect on the gaps that exist within higher education in reference to the treatment of non-white, non-Caucasian students. But before I go into that notion, let me hit you with some graduation statistics that exist among people of color. Within our institution from 2003 to 2012, the enrollment of minority people of color students has increased by 23%. In fall of 2012, reports have shown that the enrollment for minority students decreases the most between freshman to sophomore year and the transition from junior to senior year in college. Now what this means is that somewhere between freshman and sophomore year and junior and senior year, we are more likely to push out, drop out, or stop out. A lot of it, when you look at statistics, they say students have dropped out of post-secondary institutions. Well, there's more than one story to that dropout because, like I said, there are three categories: the dropout, the push out, and the stop out. The number of graduate students after their senior year that go on to graduate school for students of color is even lower. That graduation rate dropped by almost 18% in a master's program and by 37% at the doctoral level, which is a substantial decrease from undergraduate to graduate school. So the question that we have to start to raise, and has continually been raised, is why do these gaps exist? And there are a number of reasons, and I'm only going to speak about a couple today that are near and dear to my heart. In 2006, Gloria Ladson-Billings had done a presidential address at AERA, and she stated that the word achievement gap in Google search engine, if you type it in, produces 11 million citations. Well, today in 2013, 7 years later, that number has risen to 21,900,000. Now, the gaps in education in 2010, the National Center for Educational Statistics shows us that the achievement gap between Black and white students has increased by almost 6%. And some people say, oh, it's only 6%. It's still an increase from 6%. Now, I am providing you this example because I'm hoping to provide insight into the gaps that exist within our post-secondary educational system and how over time they have evolved. Some would like to believe that racism no longer exists, or at least not within our institutions. I was informed that a presidential candidate once stated here at this institution that racism does not exist here in MSU. Now, either there is a closing of the eyes or a blanket that has been pulled over those eyes. In many regards, there is a great concern for the well-being and survival of diversity in reference to educational outcomes, especially considering departments of ethnic studies that have helped students like me transition throughout our educational trajectory. Diversity has become sort of a safe word in education. It's being misused and abused. And what I mean by that is that when we define diversity, I do it from the perspective of Black feminism and critical race theory, which says that when you talk about diversity, you have to think about race, class, gender, language, and many other forms of intersections. Though our educational institutions have represented diversity as a mix of races working collaboratively in the classroom, there are gaps, especially untold stories that are excluded in terms of representation of diversity. And what I mean by that is when you think about the word diversity and you look at the websites of post-secondary institutions, or you get a pamphlet for post-secondary institutions, you see a mix of people of color working together at a table. You see a mix of people of color walking amongst campus. And though our educational institutions have represented diversity, throughout my post-secondary educational experience, I noticed that this atmosphere does exist. But the problem is that what that word diversity does is overshadow a subtle presence of isolation, discrimination, and marginalization that also has the ability to create a sense of loneliness and self-isolation because of a presence of a dominant majority that excludes the cultural wealth and richness that is possessed by students and faculty of color. Now, I am not saying that we are not allowed to sit at the round table during discussions within these institutions. But what I am saying is that the voices that we represent are drowned out by what are considered much more worthy and important causes. Now, we have referred to the civil rights movement as a time of progress in great measure, and it was. And I am thankful for the symbolic and much needed efforts, especially on behalf of those of my race that marched, protested, and fought both physically and strategically to improve the current economic and social conditions that existed at that time. Now, as I reflect on the notion of racism, I think about how the signs have changed. Notice that I said signs and not times. And what I mean by that is that the presence of racism has not ceased to exist, it has just become more subtle. Well, what does that mean? In 2004, I remember when I first graduated from New Mexico State with my bachelor's degree. And my family came to pick me up, and they had driven all the way from Omaha, Nebraska, about a 20-hour drive. And during that time, we traveled down Interstate 54 East, headed back home, which cuts through Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and then you eventually, after 20 hours, end up in the state of Nebraska. 16 if you drive like my stepfather. I remember my family stopping and attempting to eat at a small diner in Amarillo, Texas. And the sign on the door did not read like the times of during Jim Crow and civil rights where it said whites only. But what that sign said was gone to a hanging. And see, it didn't blatantly say that my family was not allowed to eat at that restaurant, but what it did was state the consequence for our actions if we felt that we were entitled to eat there with other people. And in that moment, I had to reflect on how far society has come, but yet how stationary do we remain. And as I stood there, I read the sign for a brief moment, and I turned around to notice that the rest of my family had already retreated to the car without even giving me a warning. And I use the word retreat in a comical sense, because I've never seen my stepdad and my mother move so fast. But the message that we received, whether it had been in 1960 or in 2004, was that our kind was not welcome. And the rest of that 12-hour trip home, the message that we individually got was the same, but our interpretation of what should be done was different. Now, what does this have to do with education? Some of you are probably asking yourself, why should you even go there? I have, for the past 4 years, been conducting and studying research in regards to the Black student experience in higher education. And the message that my family and I received in Amarillo, Texas, is one that we as Black students and people of color are starting to receive similar messages of unwelcomeness and know your place within educational institutions. Whether it is related to our student organizations or during the process of tenure for our faculty, or as an educator or student in the classroom and hearing the biases from racial micro and macro aggressions on behalf of our peers and colleagues. Now, racism exists on two levels, the micro and the macro. And I bring up racism because it is one of the most denied forms of intersectional subordination when it comes to admitting its existence. But I'm at a banquet full of black people, so I'm gonna speak about racism. Because whether or not we want to believe it, it pertains to the process by which we are educated at the primary, secondary, and post-secondary level, and continues to evolve within those levels. In the last couple of months, as a nation, we have witnessed acts of racism. One very close to home, by the tagging of posters with racial slurs in regard to our first black female student body president. And then the same incident taking place at Oberlin College in Ohio, and then another incident at the University of Mississippi where posters of President Obama were burned and yelling of racial slurs was very prominent as 400 students marched in protest of his presidency. Another reality check that I like to cash is here today on campus. I received a phone call from a student that I mentor very near and dear to my heart that said, I have something I need to speak to you about that happened to me today in class, today. And so this student came to my classroom, he waited for me to finish teaching. And he said in class today, and he has spoke about statistics and sometimes how they lie. Well, he was verbally attacked by an older white man who the argument had become it had sprouted so far, and I have no idea why the professor didn't intervene before it reached that level, but this white man decided to attack his race and say to him, that's why we don't hire young African Americans because their temper is so bad, or because they are lazy, and if he was working, he would never hire African Americans to work for him because they are unproductive. Well, I wish he was sitting in this room today so he could see the productivity that exists among African Americans. I speak to these things in order to first combat an issue. We have to acknowledge that it exists. Robin Barnes once posted in Harvard Law Review that people of color are constantly having to fight for their rights in educational institutions which other people feel that they are already entitled to. In the 1960s, the Civil Rights Campaign fought against racism in its existence, and during that time, educational research had developed a very deficitness of the attributors to the lack of success among African Americans in our educational system. There were reports that stated a cultural deficit existed. For example, the statements that poor people, especially people of color, had nothing to offer, by stating that we had a lack of familial support, that we had a poor language, that the reason that we fail is because of our placement in educational institutions were factors that contributed to the gap that existed within education. I myself stand here before you today as a product of a single-parent home where there were times when we had no lights. And I remember on numerous occasions carrying water in a bucket from the house next door so that my siblings and I could bathe. And I moved from house to house 17 times from the time I was in kindergarten to senior high school. And I am a doctoral candidate that has previously and will graduate with honors. Now, many of the students I work with here today at this institution, you come from backgrounds that incorporate stories of struggle, of extreme conditions of poverty, and enrollment in high poverty educational institutions, and you are here today. And some of you as graduates and some of you as future graduates, so give yourself a round of applause. But within those lines of struggles, there is a story of persistence, of perseverance, of cultural richness, and motivation that can go unnoticed and overlooked because of the emphasis on whose culture is capital. But many of us stem from communities that have raised us, from that old woman who used to sit on her porch, that if you stepped across her garden, she might whip your butt and then tell your mother that she did it. And as fortunate as we are to overcome such obstacles that we have faced, we continue to create pathways of opportunity that so many other people have done before us. Now, nothing irritates me more than when I hear a young black person say, I came to college, I want to get my degree so that I can live comfortably. And the reason that I say that is because you have to think about the notion of comfort and what does it mean. Because comfort is more than being founded strictly on financial capability. Because if you are a millionaire living in Mississippi, or attending Oberlin College, or a victim of the 250,000 hate crimes that take place on a yearly basis in this country, would you still be living comfortably? Absolutely not. Now, so the question then becomes, even though we have been victims of such subtle and heinous discriminatory acts, where do we sit or stand during such trying times? Do we take a back seat? Do we sit towards the front of the bus? Or when do we begin to drive the bus that advocates for our purpose and the right to receive an equitable and socially just treatment in this country that we and our ancestors helped build and have taken our place as leaders and role models? Let me say to my students here today, do not make an excuse for those who have wronged you, or allow the powers that be any justification for the manifestation of your marginalization. You must practice advocacy and student persistence. We say when instances of racism, micro and macro happen, oh, I just ignore it. I'm gonna let it go. It's nothing new. That is unacceptable. Paulo Freire stated in the 1970s, he speaks to the notion of self-depreciation. And what does that mean? Self-depreciation is a characteristic that derives from the internalization of the opinion of an oppressor. You have fought long and hard to get where you are, and there is no place for feelings of unfitness and welcomeness in your mental capacity. At the forefront of discrimination, we have been victims in multiple capacities because of intersectional differences that exist among race, class, gender, education, language, citizenship. So yes, we have continued to be victims of ignorance and fear, but we must not victimize ourselves. And there's a difference between being a victim and victimizing yourself. Being a victim is something that in many instances we cannot control. But your victimization refers to a sense of pity and how you expect others to pity you and open a door for you so that you can walk through it. The time to feeling sorry for yourself is over. As you sit in your courses as the only black student or student of color, you have to advocate against the presence of conventional wisdom. See, the epistemological presence that you possess is one of importance. You have something to offer, and it needs to be shared. The institutional capitalization is one that represents a majoritarian culture, as we like to say in critical race theory and black feminism. And it mediates an action of discrimination against the culture of the less valued populations of society. Now, do not become characters in the assimilated circumstances that exist because you choose to adopt a dominant cultural value. You have to start to define your roles, your existence. As living and breathing human beings, we need to engage in the practice of capitalizing on our own human capital. The fight against oppression, such as racism, is tough. It's hard. It's sickening. It's well overdue, and it is long. But it is not impossible. Institutional discrimination is only a barrier to self-determination. But if we work together, we can create structures, and we will create possibilities to overcome such obstacles. But what that calls for is a collaboration of student organizations, of faculty coalitions, of administrators working together. These things are needed now. And I am not recommending that you fight physically, but I am recommending that you fight epistemologically, phenomenologically, holistically, and ontologically. See, my goal here is not to scold you as a mother would do to a child, or to make you feel shame. But if you have yet to fight back against the wrong that has been pursued against you, shame on you. My goal is to encourage you from one advocate to another, and to motivate potential advocates to take a stand against historical practices of discrimination that still exist in the presence of this nation. The building of student, faculty, and administrative coalitions is a start to addressing this process. It's not a means to an end, but it is a start, and it must need to start within this institution. Now let me address the statement that always seems to bother me. The statement that we try to build our foundation on is that all men are created equal in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. I won't even begin to express about sexism in that statement because that's another whole other topic. And we'll be here all day, and I know some of y'all might be ready to go home. Don't make me get on my black humanist test, because I will. But What I do want to address is the notion of creation that it does not portray. Because as much as we have fallen back on this statement, our creation is not the problem. It is how we as blacks are being treated and people of color in institutions where we are entitled to an equitable and socially just educational experience. See, the problem is not in the creation of mankind, it is in the treatment of mankind. But what I want to do is challenge you as graduates that are here today to start to pave the road to help lead students like us, even if they don't come from where we come from and they are from different walks of life, but they share in our struggles. It's an inherited responsibility, and it is yours. And when I say that it is an inherited responsibility, I mean that you need to walk in the shoes of people who have walked before you. You need to stand on the shoulders of scholars who have done research before you. That process must continue. I leave you with words spoken by Black feminist Audre Lorde. And what she states is that I was going to die, if not sooner than later, whether or not I had ever spoken myself. My silences had not protected me. Your silences will not protect you. But for every real word spoken, for every attempt I ever made to speak those truths for which I am still seeking, what are the words that you do not yet have? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own until you will sicken and die of them, still in silence? We can learn to speak when we are afraid in the same way that we can learn to work when we are tired. For we have been socialized to respect fear more than our own need for language and definition. And while we sit in silence for that final luxury of fearlessness, the weight of the silence will choke us. And I would like to close with two things. One, I would like to say to my advisor and mentor, Dr. Rodolfo Chávez, sin su apoyo, no estuviera aquí hoy. Estaré siempre agradecida. Lo amo y le doy las dos gracias. And I really hope I said that right. And also to my future graduates and my graduates today, I hope that you will take heed to what I said and know that your fight is not over. Just because you have received a degree, it is beginning. And the majority of you students here today will be receiving a bachelor's degree in your fields. And there's only 4 PhDs and I think 8 master's students. That number needs to increase. So whether or not you do it next semester, this summer, in years to come of your life, you need to pursue your graduate education because nowadays a bachelor's degree is like a high school diploma and it is not enough. So with that being said, thank you.